What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Community Farm Alliance podcast. I'm your host for the Blackberry series. My name is Vaughn Barnes, and I have with me today Kurt Mason. Although in Jefferson County, Mason Farm is in Scott County, Kentucky. Kurt, tell us, how did the farm get started?
Well, the farm it's been in our family for about 75 years. So it's passed generationally from my grandfather to my father to my brother and I. So right now there's three generations that have gone through, and the fourth is my son, who is connected to the farm because he's connected to me. And so when that farm started, I can tell you a little bit of the background about my grandfather and my father and how it passed through that lineage and how it came to me. So my grandfather was a full-time farmer, and he actually started farming as a child.
Okay.
And when he started farming, this is going back a number of years. Farming wasn't so mechanical. He had teams of horses, and
Wow.
he ran a couple of different farms and was fortunate enough to save money and to purchase actually a couple of farms in his lifetime. The one that was passed to my dad is we call it the family farm. It's been in the Mason family again for about 75 years.
Wow.
And when my grandfather, I remember him a little bit. He passed away when I was 7 years old. So when I remembered thinking of him, he was a man that he was pretty sizable. He was kind of a big fellow. And I remembered him as always being in bib overalls and working every time that I saw him. He was on the farm doing something, and mostly what I remembered him from was in the tobacco patch or the tobacco field. And along with him was my father, several of my uncles, and that was the beginning of where I first learned about farming. I was one of these kids that was always underfoot, kind of more in the way than anything as a young person, trying to help, but being more in the way than being helpful.
Wait a minute. Underfoot? So the underfoot means that you're in the way.
Yes. It means I was in the way. Every time they turned around, they were stepping on me or stepping on my feet, or just, I wanted to get close to do things, but really as a 6 or 7 years old, you just wanted to be active. And so with my grandfather, he farmed from daylight to dark and was always hustling, trying to find a way to make farms pay for themselves. And he really wanted his kids, his sons, he had 3 sons. He wanted those 3 sons to be engaged in farming. 2 of those decided that they would go a different route. And my dad was really the only boy that decided to stay in the farming business. There were 3 girls too, or 2 girls, and the 2 girls married farmers. But my dad was the only one that stayed around Scott County, around Georgetown, of his siblings to farm. So when my grandfather passed away, he passed away when he was 60 years old. He was a young guy, had a heart attack. And so that meant that the farm automatically passed from my grandfather to his wife, my grandmother. And it was interesting in those days, my grandfather had a wheel. And in that wheel, although it was joint property between him and his wife, I think wheels were looked at a little bit differently during that period of time, because when he wrote that wheel, what he wrote was that my grandmother would always have a lifetime home on that farm. And
Wow.
if she ever remarried, then that farm had to go to the kids, to
Huh.
my father, his brothers and sisters. And so at the age of about in the late 70s, when my grandmother was in her late 70s, she decided to remarry. And then that meant that that will had to be enacted, that that asset automatically went to the kids.
Wow.
And so my father was in a farming business with his mother. As I mentioned, the other kids were no longer on the farm. Okay, they had gone away. And my father was in a farming business with his mother. And they essentially, what he did was in that partnership, he owned some equipment, he owned some livestock, and my grandmother owned the land. So he was essentially a renter from her, but in partnership with her to help her make a living off of that farm. And so when my grandmother remarried, that farm went to the siblings, which meant that all of those siblings either had to farm that in unison. It was 120 acres. They had to farm it in unison together or sell the farm and each one of them take their part and then do what they will with that property. Okay, so my dad really wanted to buy the 120 acres. He wanted to buy the 120 acres, but he couldn't afford 120 acres of land. And this is going back to 1959, 1960. And Dad was a veteran of World War II. He had come out of the military. When he came out of the military and farming in unison with his father and mother at that time, till his father passed away, and farming with them, he was kind of an on-the-ground stakeholder of that farm. When my grandfather passed away and that farm went up for sale, my dad's option was to buy the farm in its entirety and then try to finance that and make a living farming. So in the 1960s, it was hard for a Black landowner to get a loan. There wasn't a loan coming through USDA, through the what was called the Farmers Home Administration, because Farmers Home Administration didn't even visit Black farmers. I mean, they should have visited, but they didn't. There wasn't money available through what was called the old ASCS office, which is the Agricultural Stabilization and Conservation Service. That's now the Farm Service Agency. There wasn't an opportunity for him to get funding through them either. I'd asked my dad, since you were in the military, why didn't you try to get a loan through the GI Bill? And his response was, well, he had tried going through the GI Bill, but what the GI Bill did was they moved that over to local banks. Okay. You could get money through the GI Bill, but it had to be supported by your local bank. There weren't any Black bankers in Scott County. There were not assets that he could walk into the bank and say, I'm a veteran. I spent my time serving in the military during World War II. I'd like to get a loan. That bank was comprised of local people that were on the board, which a lot of cases were farmers that really didn't want to see Black farmers progress. They weren't interested in making loans to Black farmers at that time. So it was difficult for him to get a loan. He did have an insurance policy that he fell back on, and that's how he got the money to purchase that farm. So
did he buy the whole 120?
Well, no, he didn't buy the whole 120 because he couldn't afford the 120. But he did offer the siblings And a lot of people experience this when assets change from one generation to the next through the death of a family member. Okay, so he had offered his brothers and sisters to buy the farm, and he offered a price on it. And they didn't really think that the price he offered was reasonable, or at least reasonable enough that they wanted to take that. And so the options at that time of transferring that property was you can try to buy your siblings out, or you can send that farm to an auction and let it be auctioned off. And when Dad offered the price on it, and they didn't really want to take that, their next option was to let it go to the auction block and let's sell it at essentially at an auction. Let bidders bid on it. So in the community that farm is located in is a community called Oxford. Every little county has their own little communities. There were about 3 black farmers in Oxford at that time. I could count the ones on my hand that were there. There had been word, and you heard word throughout the community. I didn't know, but my dad did. There was some resentment years and years ago when my grandfather bought that farm. When he bought it at a private sale from a white guy that owned the property. And there had been kind of talk around the country store that when that farm passed, there would never be another black owner that owned that property. Okay. So when it went to an auction, Dad had found a partner of his that was white. Really nice family. Really, really nice family. And talked about buying the farm and splitting it down the middle. 60 acres and 60 acres. And Dad told the other fella that bought that farm, or that was going to do the bidding on it, he said, we can buy it together in partnership and split it down the middle. But he said, you're going to have to bid on it, because if I bid on it, either the price is going to go up so high that it's got not make it affordable, but they won't bid against you like they will me. They won't bid against you like they will me. And so when it went to the auction, the other guy bid on it, and he got the farm. Bought the 120 acres at a reasonable price. Okay. And when I say it was a reasonable price, it actually brought less than what my dad had offered his siblings. And so that made a little bit of a tension there. I mean, and then one of the siblings said it would be nice if you paid us what you offered at first. And he said, no, that's not gonna happen. He said, you could have bid on it. I mean, it was just tension. So that's family tension. But anyway, the other fellow that bid on it, the rest of the community kind of got a little bit mad at the white guy because he went in a partnership with a black guy to buy that farm. And it became 2 60-acre tracts. And the 60 acres was split down the middle. And that's how my dad got the 60 acres.
Did you know that CFA is a nonprofit organization that supports family farms, equity work, food access, and policy work across Kentucky? If you're interested in supporting any of this work, please go to cfaky.org and go to our donate tab in order to donate or become a member today. We really appreciate any and all help that we get, and it goes back to helping both farmers and consumers across the Bluegrass State. For more information, go to www.cfaky.org. Once again, that's www.cfaky.org. Thank you. And now back to our show.
That's a crazy story, because I've heard so many different times how families and heirs properties have either broken down because of disagreements or people not wanting to pay out a certain amount. That is so wild that so many stories happen like that. But now that the property Mason Farm is between you and you said your brother, but I know it's your niece.
Yes.
Between you and your niece now, you guys do what with it?
Okay, so I'm approximately 70 miles from that farm. And so for me to actively farm that every day or even every week is difficult, because I'm more of a hands-on type person, and I like to see if I'm growing something, I want to see it every day. If I have livestock, I need to have my eyes on that. So with it being 70 miles from me, the decision was to lease it out and put the entire 60 acres in hay. So the entire 60 acres is being farmed by a young fella that is in the hay business. So he grows alfalfa hay, and he grows orchard grass and red clover hay. Now the alfalfa hay, he grows probably, besides the 60 acres of hay on the Mason farm, he probably has, I want to say, maybe 125, 130 acres of hay that he's growing. And his market is really towards the horse farms in Lexington. So he's growing alfalfa, square baling it, and selling that to the horse industry so that they can feed their horses a quality alfalfa hay. The red clover and orchard grass that's grown is grown for beef cattle. So that's to beef cattle farmers. The decision to put that farm in hay was kind of twofold. One is the ground lays fairly good. It's from a land classification, it's mostly B slope, which is considered row crop ground. But my dad never liked to grow that whole farm in row crops. Because one is he thought that there were a lot of waterways and other things that needed to be skipped. And unless he was doing it himself, tenants didn't really take as good care of the land as he would. So the decision was to keep it in a long rotation of hay. And then at the end of the hay cycle, it might go to corn or soybeans for 1 year and then go back to hay again. Because it's located so close to Lexington, there's a hay market. And for the tenant that's growing that's what he's set up to grow. You don't have an erosion problem. And the other thing with growing row crops or traditional row crops like corn and soybeans is they mine the nutrients out of the ground. And if you mine the nutrients out, they have to be replaced. And if you're replacing those, depending on what your tenancy is on that property, there are some tenants that will grow crops until the yields start going down, and then they go off someplace else. So if you're stuck with a piece of property that doesn't have its fertility, then you're going to have to replace that fertility on that land before you rent it back out again. And that gets to be pretty costly.
How do you know when that happens if you're looking at a property?
So you would take a soil test every year. And what that soil test will tell you is the fertility of that land. It'll tell you about the soil pH that you want to keep in the range of about 7.0. and then you would have nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium at a fairly high level. Each year you take a crop off of there, you mine the nutrients. The pH lowers, the nitrogen and the phosphorus and the potassium will go down. And so it's a soil test annually that you need to do to check your fertility levels.
And with the guy that's using the property now for hay, that doesn't happen with the alfalfa and the clover. That doesn't happen with that.
It does happen with it, but not at the magnitude that it does with corn and soybeans. Plus, in his lease agreement, he has to maintain the soil pH, which means that he's responsible for putting the lime on that property to return it back to whatever the pH was when he leased it. And in terms of fertilizers, those hay crops are not big users of a lot of fertilizer. So it's to his advantage to keep the fertility up.
Now, it's crazy that you know all of this stuff. And I'm going to throw this out there. The name Kurt Dirt. Where did this come from? How did that work itself into what people started to call you around Jefferson County?
Okay, so I serve on the board of the Food Literacy Project. And everyone on the Food Literacy Project has to have a farm name. Everyone that's on that board. So when I came on that board, they asked me, well, what do you want your farm name to be? And so Dirt rhymes with Kurt. And when I was a young kid, actually, kids are kind of cruel. So on the playground, they would call me Kurt Dirt. And that kind of stuck with me. And the other reason that it stuck with me is from a professional side, I'm a soil scientist. My background is in plant and soil science. So I played in the dirt all my life. As a kid, being underfoot of my father and my grandfather in the way, playing in the dirt and in the way. And then as a high school student, I had an avocation for soils, and I made that part of my career.
What's so funny is I remember the first time that, and I'm going to name drop, Lilius Petty Scott says, "Oh, do you know Kurt Mason?" And I'm like, I have no idea who this guy is. And this one I'm just tiptoeing the agriculture. She's like, you gotta know Kurt. You gotta know Kurt. Kurt Dirt. You gotta know him. And I'm like, well, what does he do? So at the time when Lilius was saying that, this is roughly about 3-4 years ago. Tell us, where were you at in your career?
Okay, so Lilius Pettit Scott worked for the Soil and Water Conservation District. We actually kind of shared an office space or an office building. And I worked with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. At that time, when about 3 years ago, I was 1 year from retirement with USDA. I had spent 44 years with the Natural Resources Conservation Service.
So what is it that, because in Jefferson County ag, people know Kurt Mason. What is it that everybody knew Kurt Mason for?
Probably for my background and my love of teaching people about the land, about soils, and about how important soils and the land is to everyone, regardless of whether you're a farmer or whether you live in an apartment. That the soil is something that you can't get away from, regardless of what your walk of life is. As kids, we play on our favorite playground. And one of the things that we probably noticed as kids, even in the city, was some playgrounds drained better than others. And the reason that they drained better than others had to do with the soil type and soil texture.
Now, in Jefferson County, and this is something that I noticed roughly around maybe 3 years, and in 2 years ago, there were a lot of high tunnels popping up in the city. What role did you have to play in making high tunnels happen in Jefferson County?
Okay, so that's interesting. So in my history with USDA, I spent 44 years with them, and most of the time, most of that career was working with what I call traditional farmers, those people that grow corn, wheat, soybeans, livestock, beef cattle, sheep, things like that. Um, 10 years before I retired, I really wanted to make a difference in the urban population and their thoughts about agriculture. And so every year, every 5 years, there's a farm bill that is administered through the Department of Agriculture. And every year that I read that farm bill, it seemed like that it was really geared towards those traditional farmers. But the more I read the farm bill, there were pieces in there that really talked about land, soil, and the availability and the ability to grow. Inside the farm bill, it doesn't say that to be a farmer, you have to have 50 acres or 100 acres or 20 acres. There are areas of the farm bill that address growing crops if you have the medium to grow it in, which is soil.
Nice.
So the connection with the high tunnels in the city of Louisville was if you had a lot and you had soils in your backyard, that meant that you could be eligible for a USDA program. And so in talking with some of the property owners in West Louisville, I asked, are you interested in being a farmer? Well, I'm not a farmer. I said, yes, you are. You can be by USDA standards. It says that if you grow plant materials or if you grow fiber and you have a place to grow that, then you're eligible for any USDA program that might come your way. The sticking part to having access to those USDA funds is that you have to have what's called a farm number and a tract number on your piece of property. And so I started telling folks that you can go to the Farm Service Agency, ask them to give you a farm and tract number, just like I have a Social Security number. That Social Security number enables me someplace down the road, maybe to get Social Security. In order to get benefits from USDA, you have to have this unique number on your land. It's called a farm and tract number. Does not cost you a penny to get that. If you walk in that office and tell them, I've got a quarter of an acre, I want to get a farm and tract number so I have eligibility for USDA programs, they have to give you one.
Now, is it a quarter of an acre or is it any size or what?
It's any size. It's
Okay.
any size. It can be, you can have a 20 by 20 piece of property without a house on it that is capable of growing vegetables like a garden. You can get a farm and tract number for that piece of property. Show owners to it or show that you have control of that property and indicate that it's not 100% concrete, then you get a farm and tract number. So I was getting all these folks to go to the Farm Service Agency and say, I want to get a farm and tract number for my piece of property. Once they got that farm and tract number, that made them eligible for the USDA High Tunnel program. And through the high tunnels, they were funded through USDA to put those high tunnels on their new farm, on their piece of property.
Is it okay if I say that, and I'm saying it, you don't have to agree or not, but Kurt Mason is the godfather of high tunnels in Jefferson County?
Sure.
Farmers Market Support Program Services. Did you know that a program like this exists in the state of Kentucky? If your market has been around for a while, or maybe you are a new and existing market, we offer marketing development. We also offer business development. we want to offer programs as such like capital support to support your market managers. There's a cost share program. We can establish your market with the SNAP EBT program. And lastly, we provide networking. For more information, please contact us at cfaky.org/FMSP. Again, that is cfaky.org/FMSP.
What other boards are you a part of, and why is that important?
Okay, so every board that I'm on kind of for a different reason, but it still goes back to an educational and outreach purpose. And so, for instance, I serve on the board of the Bernheim Research Forest and Arboretum. And Bernheim is comprised of about 16,000 acres that's in Bullitt County. And it has a board of about 25 people on there. So one of the things that Bernheim wants to do is to connect people with nature. So in my background in agriculture and my background in earth science and my background in nature, over the 45, 50 years, and even 60 years from the time I was in high school going back through, I never really saw a lot of people that looked like me involved in those areas of avocation. Bernheim is about nature, and I've been on that board for about 9 years, and they have events out there. And a lot of times you look around at those events and you don't see people of color there. You do not see a lot of people of color that venture out into nature. You don't see a lot that's involved in agriculture. We've steered away from there. We have intentionally moved ourselves away from those areas, and that's exactly where we need to be at. And so my reason for being on Bernheim's board was trying to connect more young people and more people of color into nature, what it has to offer, and those green spaces, and understand why it's important to have tree canopies in West Louisville where you have heat islands, why it's important to have native grasses that soak up water that prevent flooding on a large scale. It's important for us in our communities to understand why some of the problems we have in our community that deal with environmental issues go back to our knowledge and our understanding about the earth, about soils, and about the natural world around us. I also serve on another board that's called the Louisville Jefferson County Environmental Trust, which is a land trust. And the interest there is preserving land in perpetuity that can be held for agricultural uses, for farmland, for native scapes, and for wildlife habitat. So why is that important to us in the African American community? One of the reasons it's important to have land that's held in perpetuity for agricultural uses is because when a land mass goes into a conservation easement, it takes away the development rights on that property, which means that the value of that property has now dropped to the point that it is more affordable to farm it. It's more affordable for someone that wants to buy that piece of property and keep it in agriculture and farm it, as opposed to bidding against a developer for that piece of property to put high-scale houses or to put industrial sites on it. It's the affordability of land. And that's what conservation easements do, whether it is a conservation easement that moves that from one generation to the next, or it gives an opportunity for somebody that might not otherwise be able to afford that property because they have to outbid a developer for it.
Now you mentioned, and this is off camera, you mentioned a couple of the other boards that you were part of. Talk a little bit about, and I want to go into CFA. What is the importance of CFA, and what do you see going on with that organization?
Okay. So the Community Farm Alliance, I haven't been on that board for a long period of time, but I've been involved with CFA for a number of different years, and it goes back again to traditional agriculture and the way the agricultural infrastructure really looks at these larger scale farms. What I found with CFA is that it's geared towards smaller farmers that a lot of farm programs and a lot of the Farm Bill does not recognize. So the Community Farm Alliance is a voice for smaller farmers. It's a voice for underserved farmers, and it's a voice for those people that traditionally have not been heard by the larger scale Department of Agriculture. With the Community Farm Alliance, one of the things that the Community Farm Alliance does is really to address the plight of Black farmers. The plight of Black farmers. So why is that important? The reason that it's important is because through my whole career with USDA, when I talked to other Black farmers, they were comfortable talking with me because I looked like them. They were comfortable with talking with me because what I told them was the truth about programs and how to be resilient and how to go after those programs if you really wanted to enter into that landscape. One of the fallacies, and this is historically with Natural Resources Conservation Service, with the Farm Service Agency, and with Farmers Home Administration, is a lot of Black farmers and a lot of Black agriculturalists were turned away because they did not keep their foot on those agencies to say, this is what I want from you. And a lot of times there was misinformation being furnished to those landowners. So there was a tool within USDA that came out about 7 or 8 years ago. It's called a receipt for service. If you go to the grocery store and you buy something, at the end of your payment, you get a receipt that shows what you paid. USDA has this little unknown document called a receipt for service. And that is when you talk to those folks in that office, when you get finished, if you ask them for a receipt for service, they're supposed to furnish you with a document that talks about everything that you asked them. And it also is incumbent on them to give you a time frame of when they're going to get back with you and provide you with those services. So in the traditional setting with those agencies, if you ask them for an unknown document called a receipt for service, it scares them to death because now you know what they know. You know what they know.
Now, this is the part of the interview that normally trips people up. So I'm gonna give you some time to think about it.
Okay.
But this is the Blackberry series.
Okay.
What berry would you say best represents Kurt Mason and Mason Farm?
What berry? Okay.
Go ahead. You got time. I'm gonna give you some time to think about it. The berry that best represents Kurt Mason and Mason Farm.
Okay. So the berry that best represents Kurt Mason and Mason Farm to me is this unique berry that I learned about when I was about 12 years old. And it was called a gooseberry. A gooseberry. And I had never seen that berry before. It stood out at one of my neighbors that was growing that, and it was unique. It was different. It wasn't with the rest of the berries. It wasn't with the strawberries. It wasn't with the blackberries. It was unique and different, and it walked its own path. And that's what I think of when I think of me and my background and the path that I took and where Mason Farm is right now. That it's in an area that is, it's an area that is growing. Mason Farm is about a half a mile from the Toyota plant. It's still in place. It's still an agricultural operation, and it's kind of unique in that it is still a hay and a beef cattle operation if somebody wants to turn it into beef cattle. But it's got its place for uniqueness, and it's owned by a Black landowner.
Okay. Now, I know we're wrapping up and getting close to the end of the interview. There were so many gems that you've left for everybody to be able to indulge and learn from and use in their operations. So now, are there any other things that you would hope to tell an up-and-coming farmer or student that would want to be in agriculture?
So I tell young people this all the time. The biggest decisions that you make in your life is probably going to be centered around soil and the earth, whether you know it or not. If you buy a house and you decide to build or to buy on a piece of property, the success of that house and the foundation of it is going to be incumbent on what type of soil it sets on. I think that regardless of who you are, your understanding and reading of the soil is important because it tells you things like how that soil drains, whether your basement is going to be full of water, whether your foundation is going to crack, whether you're going to make a good investment or a bad investment in a piece of property. Don't be hesitant about getting your hands dirty, about playing in the dirt, about digging a hole and seeing what's underneath the surface. Because if you're going to spend money and dedicate a lot of your hard-earned money into a piece of property, it makes sense for you to go back to your childhood, dig a hole, play in the dirt, and understanding what you're going to purchase.
All right. Now we've come to the end of the podcast. We come to the end of the episode. And like I always say, real change comes from the ground up. And until next time, peace.